This is my deck tag on the Simic Threshold deck archetype. I've seen several lists of this running around, not so many since Drake came out, because this deck is vulnerable to graveyard hate, and with so much graveyard hate running around because of Peregrine Drake, it makes it a little bit difficult to play this deck. I do enjoy this deck quite a lot. I have it in paper. I've made a few changes to the deck that I have not implemented in my paper copy, just because it's a little bit more difficult to get cards in paper than it is just on Magic Online. Just go to a bot and pick it up. But this is the deck that I have in paper, and I've been playing with for a little while now. So the simple goal of this deck is to play cheap, aggressive, powerful threats and protect them with counterspells, generate card advantage, generate tempo, and kill your opponents relatively quickly. That Werebear and Nimble Mongoose, Delver of Secrets, these guys can end games fast when they are allowed to. And you use your suite of counterspells and bounce effects and offsetting your opponent's tempo to allow them to get that job done. So we're going to start off with the actual deck tech and run through some of the cards quickly. And we're going to start with the land. Land, we have 6 fetch lands of a mix of Terramorphic Expanse and Evolving Wilds. These are great because they help to fuel our graveyard as well as mana fix us, as well as having some nice synergy incidentally with Brainstorm. So for this list, we do run for a Brainstorm. They combo very well with trying to flip a Delver, as well as helping us to get 3 cards at instant speed, and using fetch lands and other shuffle effects. We can try to abuse Brainstorm to have it draw 3 for us and be a pseudo Ancestral Recall. This deck does run 18 lands. It is pretty land light, but that is because we don't really need much mana. The deck's curve tops out at 3, and even then there's only a few 3-drops in the entire deck, and that includes sideboard. As well as we have Werebear as a mana dork, and Grapple the Past to help get lands back from our graveyard if we have milled too many through our milling. The mixture of basics, I'm running currently 8 islands, 3 forest. I've seen some versions of the deck that run like 1 forest, or 1 forest and 2 of the green-blue dual land. And I don't like those versions because I feel like you are milling yourself with Grapple at the Past, with Thought Scour. A lot of lists run Mental Note. That when you're milling yourself and you're running 1 green source or 2 green sources in the deck, you run the risk of milling out your green source very easily. And now you suddenly can't cast Delver, you suddenly can't cast Nimble Mongoose, you can't cast Werebear, and that's not a risk that I want to take. So I normally run somewhere between 3 to 4 green sources in the deck on top of Werebear, just to make sure that I am able to cast those few green spells in the deck, but primarily the lands are blue. Starting out in the creature suite, we've got Delver of Secrets. This is, of course, Delver. He's a powerful threat in the air. He's incredibly cheap and very powerful, very aggressive creature. Next is Nimble Mongoose, 1/1 Shroud with Threshold +2/+2. You can normally in this deck get Threshold online about turn 3, sometimes turn 4 if you have a slower hand. But traditionally you're going to have Threshold on about turn 3, meaning that on turn 3 you have this 3/3 with Shroud that is very difficult to block, it's very difficult to kill, and is normally going to be very effective in combat outside of Edicts. And right now, Edicts are not very effective because they don't work well against Peregrine Drake, so at the moment you don't have to worry too much about Edict effects. But many decks still do run Edicts, so you do need to be wary of that. Next is Werebear. Werebear is a 2-mana 1/1 with Threshold +3/+3, and the ability to be a mana dork to just tap to add 1 green to our mana pool. Werebear being a 4/4 is a very big deal because it means it fights most things in the format outside of Burma Gangler, Gearseeker Sermit, and Ulamog's Crusher, on top of a handful of others. It beats and kills most creatures in the format, and this allows it to get in there, get in some damage, and try and be aggressive once you get control of the board. The last creature in the deck, and a bit of a weird choice, is the Errant Ephemeron. This creature is effectively a 2-mana 4/4 flying haste with a delay on it. That the Ephemeron is a creature that I can play when I have extra mana. That I can, okay, well, I have some extra mana this turn, or maybe I have Daze as a backup, so I can afford to go shields down for a turn, and I can play him, put him on suspend, and 4 turns later, I have this massive flyer in the air with haste that can swing in and get a lot of damage in. He is 7 mana natural, so you can hard cast him, although in a deck with 18 land, 6 of which are fetches and don't tap for mana, you are very, very rarely going to get to that mana necessary to actually hard cast him. He is hard castable, unlike some suspend cards, which don't have a mana cost at all. This guy has a mana cost, but it is so high that you're really only going to be able to play him with suspend. So that is one downside to this guy. That you can't, unlike Muldrifter or Gurmaging or some other cards in some other decks, you can't just, well, I need him now and hard cast him. That is not very likely here. Moving on now to our cantrips, and I am going to cover all the cantrips at once and skip around a little bit. We're going to start off with Brainstorm. We have four Brainstorms. They combo very well with our fetch lands, with Delver of Secrets. They combo very well with Thought Scour and Grapple the Past and our other mill effects, as well as letting us go 3 cards deep at instant speed to help us dig for an answer like a counter spell or a bounce effect or something more card draw. If we need it, we can bring in other cards out of the sideboard that are instants to help us get there. So being able to go 3 cards deep at instant speed is very powerful and very effective, and having incidental interactions and combos with other cards in this deck to help make Brainstorm far better is awesome. We have next up is for Thought Scour. This card you can use early to fuel your graveyard for Threshold, as well as cantrip yourself to get another card into your hand. And the fact that Thought Scour can target opponents means that if an opponent has pondered or preordained or somehow stacked their deck, this is an instant, and you can use that to screw up their draws as well. And in the late game, maybe you don't want to mill yourself, you can use this to target your opponent. This deck does not run 2 Mental Notes because I found that Mental Note is worse in the late game than Thought Scour is, or than most cantrips are, because you have to target yourself with the mill, which means that sometimes late game you already have Threshold turned on, you don't really want to mill, you just want to draw the card. And milling off of Mental Notes, sometimes you mill a Delver, sometimes you mill a Werebear, and that just feels bad. And so I've replaced Mental Note in this deck with Grapple with the Past. Grapple the Past is a 2 mana instant for 1 and a green that you play it, and it mills the top 3 cards of your library, and then you choose a creature or land card from your graveyard and put that into your hand. The fact that this is instant is awesome because it allows you to save creatures from graveyard hate, some Bojuka Bog or Relic of Progenitus or some other graveyard hate. You can, in response to that, go and get a Werebear or a land or something out of your graveyard that you need to try and save it from that removal. As well as the card fueling the graveyard by putting 3 cards on its own into the graveyard after you have returned something. This would put 4 cards into the graveyard, making it strictly better than Mental Note or Thought Scour just for fueling Threshold, but because you pull 1 card out of it, you're only netting 3 cards in the graveyard, which is still good, that you are still netting 3 cards in the graveyard for 1 card and drawing a card out of it. Next on our card draw spells, we have Accumulated Knowledge. Accumulated Knowledge is great in this deck because of the incidental mill that we have through Thought Scour and Grapple to Past. If you can mill a Accumulated Knowledge through a Grapple to Past or a Thought Scour, it makes them much, much more powerful because it means you can skip straight to the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Accumulated Knowledge and skip the first one that is very poor and mana inefficient, because spending 2 mana for 1 card is not great. But if you can skip that by milling the first one, then the second one and the third one become much better because you never had to waste the mana on the first one. It does count all graveyards, so if you're playing against somebody like Teachings or Forbidden Alchemy, some other decks that may run this, some control decks run it, you also get added value out of that because you get to count off of their graveyard as well for the Accumulated Knowledge. The final card draw spell here in the deck is Una's Grace. Una's Grace is a 3 mana instant draw. Target player draws a card with a retrace. You can use this to help in the late game filter unwanted lands from your hand and turn those into real cards. Because this is an instant, you don't have to worry about bogging down your tempo or messing up mana on this. You can just do it at the end of your opponent's turn. This is great because occasionally people will forget that it exists, and so you'll have some people who will duress you occasionally, and they'll just see you have a land there are 2 lands in your hand and a creature or something, and they're like, okay, whatever, he has nothing. And then you can Una's Grace, discard that land, go get a real card, and then catch them, because they thought the coast was clear. Now we're going to go on to the Counterspell suite. 4 basic counterspells. It's Counterspell. It's awesome. We're in blue. We're going to run it. We have 2 dazes. I know some people run more, some people run less. I don't like the idea of running none. That I always want to have some number of dazes in the 75, because just the threat of daze, the fact that it exists in your deck, is such a mind game card that it makes such a massive difference in the matchup when you can say, okay, well, maybe they have it, maybe they don't. You can sideboard it out game 2, and people will still tend to play around it in some situations. That's such a powerful card and allows you to play spells and feel free to go shields down and still be safe. The final counterspell in the deck is a set of Rune Snag. Rune Snag is effectively a worse mana leak on the first one, and it gets better and better with each subsequent one played because they count the graveyard just like Accumulated Knowledge. Rune Snag also count the ones in all graveyards, not just yours. So if you are for some reason playing against a mirror match or anybody else who uses Rune Snag, this does get better with that as well. Rune Snag is very good in this deck, just like Accumulated Knowledge, because you do have Incidental Mill. So milling the Rune Snag, the first Rune Snag or the second Rune Snag, does make them much, much better. Now the last card we have here in the deck, in the main board, is Temporal Spring. This is this deck's bounce spell. Why I'm running this over Vapor Snag is a few reasons. One, Temporal Spring is much, much more annoying for your opponent. To buy time is normally what you're using bounce effects for. Temporal Spring buys so much more time than Vapor Snag does, because Temporal Spring can target any permanent and puts it on the top of their library. You are actually time walking somebody by playing this. That a lot of times in Magic people call bounce effects time walked because you wasted your opponent's turn, they spent all this mana to play this card, and now it's useless. They've just gotten back to square one. Well, with Temporal Spring, it is actually a time walk, because not only have you wasted your opponent's turn because they played all this mana to play this creature that's now been undone, but you have put it back on their library, so they don't even get their next draw step, so they are truly set back an entire turn by this. As well as Temporal Spring being able to hit permanents, which Vapor Snag cannot. So if your opponent has an Oblivion Ring, or an artifact, or an enchantment, or some other troublesome permanent that you need to get rid of, if your opponent has a land and you want to stifle them on mana, you can put the land back on top to wreck their draw step, as well as set them back a turn on land drops. So Temporal Spring is a very versatile card, and I feel more powerful in general than Vapor Snag is in this list, because while Vapor Snag is a good card, and instant speed and a cheaper cost is very powerful, I like the versatility and overall higher power level of Temporal Spring in this kind of deck. Now we're going to move on to the sideboard. Generally, sideboards are dependent on what meta you're playing in, where you're playing, and are customizable based on you and how you feel about it, and this is the one that I've chosen to go with. So first in the sideboard we have our 2 Dispel and 2 Hydroblast. These serve a similar purpose, and some mix and matched number of the 4 of them, of the 2 cards, is normally very good. That Dispel is great against enemy counterspells, help you fight through counter wars. It's great against Burn and Teachings and Drake and all that stuff. Hydroblast being, again, great against Burn and Teachings and Drake. Well, not Teachings, but Burn and Drake, other red decks, things like Red Deck Wins, because it can kill a red permanent, is awesome. Both these cards serve a similar purpose, and so normally mixing and matching some number of them is what most decks are after. Here I have 3 natural states. 3 natural states, why I'm running them over Natural Eyes, is because I feel like in this deck, Natural Eyes is kind of unneeded, that it's unnecessary. That I have found that most of the time the things that I'm killing with Natural State are Artifact Lands, Prophetic Prisms, Springleaf Drums, things along those lines. That I'm not often killing a Mirror Enforcer or a Frogmite, and most of my creatures are big enough to deal with Mirror Enforcers and Frogmites, and I think I would rather have the cheaper mana cost so that I can be more aggressive with them and still hold up mana for counter spells and cantrips and other spells, in exchange for the mana cost restriction. Next here in my sideboard, I have 1 Relic of Progenitus. This is just basic graveyard hate. I've seen some people running Nile Spellbomb in this slot because Nile Spellbomb does not hit your own graveyard, but I personally prefer the passive mode on Relic of Progenitus to slowly take away somebody's graveyard than the one big shot of Nile Spellbomb. Whereas Relic of Progenitus can be worse if you get it later in the game and you have to pop the Relic of Progenitus on its second ability. That can be unfortunate because you wipe away your own graveyard and reset Threshold, but I still prefer the passive effect on Relic of Progenitus for me personally. If you want to run with Nile Spellbomb, that's fine. I've seen many people do it, and if it suits you and your meta, then that's what you can do. Next up here we have one Lignify. Lignify is sort of green's removal spell. This is a 2-mana enchantment that targets a creature and turns that creature into a 0/4 treefolk with no abilities. This is great for downsizing things like Gearseeker Serpent, Gurmag Angler to a reasonable size where you can fight them, Ulamog's Crusher, some of these massive creatures that are really, really tough to deal with. You can put this on something like an Atog, something else with a very powerful ability. It's just sort of as close to removal as green is going to get at common level, and I like it as a one-of to help me deal with some threats that I normally wouldn't be able to in these colors. Gutshot is awesome because it kills enemy Delvers, pre-flip, it kills fairies, pre-flip, it kills almost everything in elves and a lot of things in Stompy. It's just good removal, and because it is technically free, you can use it while shields are down and catch people off, because a lot of people don't expect Gutshot out of the Simic deck. One Moment's Peace is next. Moment's Peace is a great card because it is double fog at a more expensive cost. So you get to fog twice in exchange for paying more mana for it, which a lot of the times people would rather have Tangle, because Tangle is 1 more mana over fog, but you get the downside of keeping your opponent's creatures tapped for a turn. Normally in this kind of deck, this aggressive deck with Delver and Mongooses where you're trying to swing in, where maybe letting your opponent get an Alpha Strike off and then using Tangle to lock them down for 2 turns so you can get in free swings is good. But because we are self-milling, I think I like Moment's Peace better, because Moment's Peace is still useful if we mill it. So we can mill aggressively with Grapple with the Past, Thought Scour, and dig for cards, and not be afraid of milling out of our fog in the case that we need it. Next up we have 2 Thermokarst. Always struggle to say that. With 2 Thermokarst, this is basically a destruction in green, 3 mana to destroy target land. It has some clause about snowlands, but nobody cares. But this is basic land destruction, great against Balance Lands, great against Tron. The final card here in the sideboard is Stormbound Geist. Stormbound Geist is a 3 mana 2/2 flyer with Undying that can only block other flyers. So Stormbound Geist is awesome because great Edict protection, as well as being very good against enemy decks that are very heavy in flyers, being Mono Blue Delver, Peregrine Drake, and decks like those. So with that quick rundown, what is the goal of the deck? What are you looking to accomplish? The goal with this deck is to apply an early creature, being it Nimble Mongoose or Delver of Secrets on turn 1, draw your cards, filter it, try and power that creature up. With Delver of Secrets, it's find a way to flip it, whether that's through Brainstorm or just sheer luck. You need to flip that creature and turn that into a flyer. With the case of Nimble Mongoose, it's Thought Scour, Grapple with the Past, play spells, fill your graveyard, get that Mongoose up to that 3/3. And once your creature is powered up, protect it with counterspells, Daze, Counterspell, Rune Snack. Use those aggressively. Use your counterspells aggressively to fight threats that your creatures cannot normally deal with on your own. Nimble Mongoose being a 3/3 with Shroud, Delver of Secrets being a 3/2 flyer, means there's a lot of things in your opponent's deck that these creatures don't care about, that they're just going to straight up run over. In this kind of deck, you're looking to kill your opponent relatively fast, that your threats are so big and so powerful that if left unchecked, they can end the game in a matter of turns. Your worst matchup with this deck is honestly really aggressive decks. But against control decks, you can normally survive and push through. Control decks can sometimes be rough. Things like Teachings and Tortured Existence that go really, really long in the game and have a massive amount of removal, those are pretty rough for you because you do have a relatively low creature count and they just are going to have more counterspells than you. But If you're lucky and the game goes right and you get a decent hand, you normally can just run them over with a werebear or delver faster than they can deal with it. Primary issue for this kind of deck is honestly faster decks, more aggressive decks, things like Red Deck Wins or Stompy, decks that can go really, really fast and kill you faster than you can play out your counterspells in a reasonable time. You don't want to be in a situation where you're having to just play one card a turn, where you're just having to hold up all your mana for counterspell, where you're just having to play a rune stack, and that's all you do in that turn. When you're playing against things like Stompy and Elves and Red Deck Wins, these decks can pump out 3, sometimes more creatures in a turn, and you can't afford to just be sitting there one-for-oneing with them. This deck is a lot like a train. It takes a little bit to get moving, and it takes some setup, and it takes a lot of force to get behind it to get going. But once that Mongoose gets online, once the Werebear gets online, once Delver gets flipped, this is a massive train. The momentum behind it is huge. You can start chaining brainstorms, you can start counterspelling stuff, accumulated knowledge loops, drawing more and more cards, grapple with the past, back a creature that they've killed that they thought they were safe, and keep pushing forward. So, with that being said, here's been the short deck tech overview on Simic Threshold. This is a great deck. I've enjoyed playing it quite a bit in paper and to a lesser extent online. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. Let me know what deck you want to be teched next. I'm going to try to do a deck tech once a week here on the channel. And if you guys want to see my streams, you can check me out on Twitch. If you guys want to see other YouTube videos, you can check that out on YouTube and subscribe there. I also upload videos on Twitch as well, so check that out. I'd love to hear your guys' comments down below if you're watching this on YouTube. I'd love to see you guys in my stream. We play Magic, we play a lot of games. I love to hang out and have fun with you guys. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.